Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Nun Bet. Purim Sameach to those who are celebrating Purim today. Today's daf is sponsored. Oh, and I just wanted to add that Mazel Tov to all those finishing the Megillah challenge. It was amazing to see all the responses and reactions, and please keep sending more. Just to hear about so many women who are doing a siyum for the first time. Many of them, they're Purim sudas, so there'll be new challenges to come. We'll be sending out Pesach. You can always find there's Pesach learning opportunities on our website. You can find it under one of the menu tabs. I forget exactly, but there's different ways to learn, and one is through holiday learning, and there's a whole course with 10 topics of Seder. Each one is a different Seder topic. It's actually kind of a skills learning course with Chavruta study. You can take 1, 2, 3, 4, as many as topics as you want. Prepare for the Seder, so we have all different learning opportunities. You could take a set of dapim from Masechet Pesachim, like the ones that relate to the Seder and Arvei Pesachim. Everything you can find on the site. These are good ways to learn. And after Pesach, we're going to start the Menachot challenge. So we'll be doing a siyum Menachot just around Shavuot, which will be a perfect timing to do a siyum on on Shavuot, Chag Matan Torah. Okay, with that, we're going to get started. Today's daf is sponsored by Adam Plunka in honor of the yahrzeit of Shmaryahu Yosef Chaim ben Yaakov Yisrael, Rav Chaim Kanievsky. Today's daf is sponsored by Abby Flamholtz in honor of the birthday of her daughter-in-law Sigal, an exceptional role model whose dedication to Torah values and raising her children with integrity is inspiring year after year. Today's daf is sponsored by Amy Goldstein in loving memory for her grandmother, Anne Gutwillig Barnett. She was an Esha Chayil who embodied aspects of all four imahot. She understood the needs of adolescent mental health far before the rest of the world, and her ideas and insights are sorely needed today. May her neshama have an aliyah. Today's stuff is sponsored by Racheli Hadak Chazan in loving memory of Sarah Chaya Bat Bruria Bat Sima, and Ephraim ben Matal Leah. Okay, on to our daf. So we saw at the very end of yesterday's class was a list of takanot, and really it was brought up as a question to Rabbi Shimon. So let's just go back to the last machloket. We have Rabbi Shimon says, what happens when the kohen gadol dies and there's no kohen gadol yet appointed? Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda have a debate. Where do we get the money to bring the mincha chavitim? We obviously have to bring it. They both agreed that it was brought whole, meaning, just a little bit weird, but instead of taking an issaron in the morning and splitting it half-half, we have to take an issaron and sacrifice it completely. Okay, today we're going to see, do we do it twice daily with a whole issaron, meaning double the amount? Okay, which we're going to see we actually do. And then the question is who pays for it. So one option was the heirs, that was Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon said, no, the community, the communal funds that were raised with the machatzit shekel once a year. So those funds were used for this purpose. So then we said, how could you say that? And then he proved it from a pasuk in the Torah, because it says chok olam. He says, it comes mishel olam, from the world, meaning from the community. We say, how could you say that's doraita? That was a takana. It was listed in these 7 takanot, which we saw 3 of them. We're going to see a 4th today, but that's it. We're going to stop there. And then the question is, how can we say it's doraita when it was a takana? And they say, the rabbis were talking specifically this, and in fact, Rabbi Shimon says it, right? I think that was the thing, right? Hatznan Amar Rabbi Shimon, that there were 7 things the Beit Din instituted, and one of them was this kohen gadol shemet, that the mincha is going to come from the communal funds. So we said, well, it actually went through a few changes. First, it was doraita the tzibor. Then there was a problem because the tzibor was running out of money. So they said, the heirs are going to bring it. And then they said, no, but then the heirs stopped doing it. So then they returned it back to the Torah law. And then we're going to see another similar one. Va'ala para, okay, starting from 3 lines from the bottom of Nun Aleph Amabet, shelo yehe mo'alim ba'afra. Okay, that the ashes of the para aduma, there's no laws of me'ilah. That was another takana. Okay, so the para itself has me'ilah, but the ashes of it don't have me'ilah, meaning doesn't have the status of kedusha, that if you use it, you basically have misused consecrated property, like if you use it for some other reason. So, how do we know this? So now we're going to say, but al parasha lo yu mo'alim ba'ofra, that was a takana, but do'oraiti, that's also a Torah law, that there's no me'ilah in the ashes. Tanya, how do we know this? Because it says, chatat hi. It's chatat, meaning melamed shemo'alim ba. That's where you learn that there's me'ilah for a para aduma, for the red heifer. He, what do we learn from the word he? Ba mo'alim, ba'efra lo mo'alim. But only the para itself, not the ashes of it. So that's a Torah loss. How could you say this was a takana? Amarav Ashi shtei takanot havai. Again, it went through 2 stages. Doraita ba'moalim. Okay, by Torah law, that was the first stage. Okay, it's not a stage. That was the lahalacha. Then, and ba'ofra moalim. So ba'moalim, the para, but not the ashes. But what happened? They did 2 takanot. First, they did 1. They said, "Kevan dechazeh tekamazalza leva v'ka'avde minei lemakatan gazru be'meila." But when they saw that people weren't treating this properly, and what were they doing? They were taking the ashes from the paraduma and preparing this ointment or some sort of, I don't know exactly whether it was in an ointment form, but they would use it to prepare this salve for putting on their wounds. We saw this before, that ashes were used to fix wounds. So they said, Gazru b'meila. They said, okay, we don't want people using the ashes of the paraduma for this. Right? I know it's important to cure people, but it seemed like an inappropriate use of the paraduma ashes. So, kevan dechazu de kaparshe, misafek hazaot, ukma doraita. But then what happened? Once they said there's me'ila on the ashes of the paraduma, people got very nervous. Nervous about what? Well, there's all sorts of cases where you could be safek tamid. Okay, what do you use the ashes of the paraduma for? Right? In general, they're used for making this mechatat, which people then you sprinkle on people who became impure to a dead body. Now, there's many times where you could become safek impure. What would that be? Let's say, for example, okay, if there's a tree and you go under a tree and there's a dead body on the ground underneath, and the tree is making like an ohel over the dead body, so you're there, that basically makes you tamid, okay? Or things like this, where there's a tuma and there's something over it and you're kind of within it. Okay, so now, what if you went under a tree? Now, you know there's 5 trees in the area, and you know that there's a dead body under one of them, but you don't know which one. Okay, actually, it's not under the ground. My mistake. It's like on the ground somewhere. Okay, it's overground. If it's underground, that's a different thing. But let's say, so if it's underground and you walk over it, right, you're going to have a problem no matter what. Sorry, I'm not being clear, but let me try to be clear. If there's, let's say, a kazayit of a dead body under a tree, now the halacha is that anywhere you go under that tree, like the branches that are coming out, even though you're not walking right on top of the piece of the dead body, but you're under the tree where under that there's a part of a dead body, that basically means that this tree is now like acting like an oil, and it's as if you're in the space where the dead body is, and it's a problem. But let's say that you heard that there was some part of a dead body somewhere around. You didn't know under which tree, and you went under one of the trees. You're now safek tamid. Okay. Now, what's the problem? Well, the problem is, in order to get out of your safek, you're not sure if you are or not, but the only way to get out is to sprinkle the paraduma waters on you. So we're going to do that out of safek. But if there's a law of me'ila in the ashes, and if you use it for the wrong purpose, it's a problem, people started saying, I don't want to get sprinkled from the ashes out of safek. And then you had all these people walking around that perhaps were actually to be made and never were fixed because they were scared because of the me'ila prohibition to go near the ashes. So because of that, they said, fine, we're putting this back to doraita, and the ashes of the paraduma don't have me'ila in them. Okay, now this is just an interesting idea in general, both what we saw yesterday and what we saw today about people not always thinking about the ramifications of, like, more importantly, governments, systems of instituting laws that they don't realize what are going to be the effects down the road. Okay, I'll give you a specific example I heard about in a podcast not so long ago about China, how they limited how many people were going to be born many years ago, and now they're having major problems as a result of it, because all these people are getting older, they don't have enough children to take care of them, they usually have about one child, and depending on, and now they're trying to encourage people to have children, but it's very difficult because for so many years they forbade people. The people got used to this, and now it's very hard to change what you did. So it's just an interesting idea, and this happens all the time, where people just don't think about what's going to be right. It could be on a government level, it could be on an individual level. In your own house, you might come up with a rule, and you don't realize, oh, that's going to affect some other things, right? This comes up all over. Anyway, let's move on. Tanu Rabbanan, our next topic, which is going to be similar to the previous, which is machloket between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about who pays for the following thing. Tanu Rabbanan, par halim davar shel tzibur v'sirei avodah zarah. These are the cases we learned about in Horayot, if you learned Horayot, which was about the community sins based on an erroneous ruling of the court. That's the par halim davar shel tzibur. The sirei avodah zarah is if the court taught them something wrong about avodah zarah, meaning, something wasn't avodah zarah, and then the people went and did it because they were told it wasn't avodah zarah. It turns out it was. So they have to bring a special, it's a little different korban. Anyway, these are two korbanot that are basically the same thing, erroneous ruling of the court, and the people follow. B'tchila magbin lehen, divrei Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda says they have to go out and collect money from the community again for this. Rabbi Shimon Omer, mitrumat halishkai bayim. Rabbi Shimon says, no, we already have communal funds collected from the trumat halishka for the temple, right, which was for the korbanot tamid and the holiday offerings, the musafim, all that. But we take it from here because it's communal money. What's the difference, right? So we already have communal money collected. It includes for this. So now the Gemara says, but wait, there's a braita where the opinions are switched. Now, often when the opinions are switched, and I say, well, one's a mistake. That's not what they say here. The Gemara assumes right now that they're switched because each one, this you don't see very often, where you have a machloka between two people, and then they each end up flipping sides, right? We have this problem in our lives nowadays that everyone's so stuck in their opinions they won't even hear the other side, forget about moving over to the other side. But in this case, not only they both flip sides, okay? So that's the Gemara's assumption, but what they want to know is Heiminayu Achrita, what's the final version? In other words, which one happened at the end? Who switched to be on what side? Conclusively. Because why do we want to know? Rashi tells us because there's a principle that when you have a machlok of Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon, the halacha is like Rabbi Yehuda. So we want to know in the end, what does Rabbi Yehuda hold? That's what's important to us. So Amrah Rabbanan conveyed to Rav Ashi. So the rabbis go to Rav Ashi and they say, Lema kamaita achrita. It sounds like the first version, the one that we read, must be the right version, must be the last version. Disham'inan leila Rabbi Shimon dechayesh lepshia. Because what did we learn in the previous sugya? That Rabbi Shimon is worried that the children won't pay the money. That was the whole thing. Right? They started off by saying it's from the tzibur. Then there wasn't enough money, so then they said, fine, let's make it on the heirs. But then what happened? The heirs it was hard to collect from them. They weren't giving the money. So wouldn't we say the same thing here that Rabbi Shimon holds? It comes from the communal funds already collected, because go try to collect from everybody in the country again. It's going to be very difficult to do that, right? People might not pay. So it's the same concern. Amar lahu Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi heard this little theory. He said, there's a problem with your theory. You could say in the same way, and even though Rabbi Shimon there is choshesh l'pshia, doesn't mean to be choshesh for that here. Doesn't mean to be worried about it here. Rabbi Shimon l'pshia. Now he's going to distinguish between the two cases. That's something when the heirs of the kohen gadol have to bring this mincha chavitin every day. They're not very motivated to pay the money for it. Why? Well, it doesn't provide them anything. They don't get any benefit from it. They don't get atonement from it. So why would they bother to pay the money? But But in this case, the whole community needs atonement. So of course they're going to pay the money. When you need atonement for something, you're willing to pay the money because you're getting something for it. So those two, you can't learn from one to the other. In which case we go back to my have Allah. We're going to see this question a lot today, which is kind of funny because we're always, in the Gemara, we'd love it if they always say my have Allah. Okay, so what's the conclusion? We want to know what to do. Usually the Gemara doesn't answer that question, but sometimes, and today we're going to see it a bunch of times, so the Gemara is going to say, okay, well, now you've confused us. So which one is it? Which one does Rabbi Yehuda say? Which one does Rabbi Shimon say? Which was the final position? Amalei Rabbi Zute le Rav Ashi. So someone else comes before Rav Ashi and says, Tashma. Let's learn from here. Detanya. And he brings him a braita. Et korbani lachmi li'ishai reach nichochi tishmeu la'akrivli b'moado. That's a pasuk about the korban tamid. Now what's strange about this pasuk, it says, my korban, my bread, li'ishai, for my fire. There's a lot of words saying for my this, for my that, for my that. It's describing the korban tamid in a lot of ways. What they want to say here is, L'rabot paralim davar shel tzibur sirei avodah zarah she'ba'im mitrumat halishka divrei Rabbi Shimon. Okay, let's start from the end. This braita is in the name of Rabbi Shimon, and what does it say? It says that the reason it uses all these words about the korban tamid, which is bought from the Trumat Halishka, obviously. That's one of the main things the money goes for. So what they want to say is all those extra words come to include also the Parlim Davar Shel Tzibur and the Surei Avodah Zarah, to say that they also, just like the Korban Tamid, come from communal funds. And that's in the name of Rabbi Shimon. So actually what the rabbis claimed before Rav Ashi, and he said, well, it's not a conclusive proof, in the end becomes true, or at least accepted. We don't know what the real truth is, that Rabbi Shimon probably in the end held that the community pays for it, just like he did in the previous machloket, although, right, they might or might not be connected. Now we're going to move back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah, the last line in the Mishnah, after we saw the machloket of Rabbi Shimon and Rabbi Yehuda, who pays for this korban in the case that the kohen gadol dies, shleima hayta kreva. In the case that the kohen gadol is dead and there's no one else in his place yet, so it's brought complete, which means, again, a whole issaron, which normally was brought for both, right, the morning and the evening, and we would split it, machzita b'boker, machzita b'erev. We would say half an issaron in the morning, half an issaron in the afternoon. Now we're going to learn that it was brought shlema. Okay, now the question is, shlema, what does that mean? So it was brought as a whole issaron. So you bring your mincha, it's not half an issaron, it's a whole issaron. But Amar Rabbi Chia bar Abba by Rabbi Yochanan, he says, Rabbi Yochanan asked, shlema shacharit u'shlema ben arbaim. Does that mean you bring double the amount? Okay, you bring a whole issaron in the morning and a whole issaron in the afternoon. Odil shlema shacharit u'betela ben arbaim. Or maybe you bring it whole in the morning and you just don't bring one in the afternoon. In other words, maybe it's the same amount. You just bring it only once a day instead of twice a day. So Amar Rava Tashma. Rava says, I'm going to prove it from here. Shmini b'chavitim. Okay, we're now in a Mishnah in Tamid. In Masechet Tamid, which we'll get to soon in our cycle. In Masechet Tamid, it talks about the Korban Tamid in this section. I happen to be talking about specifically who brings the parts of the Korban Tamid to the altar. There's 9 people who bring the different parts to the altar. And within the description of the different parts of the animals, the 8th person on the list brings the Minchat Chavitin. It's not just talking about the Korban Tamid. It's talking about these activities that are done along with the Korban Tamid. Along with the Korban Tamid, the Kohen Gadol brought his Minchat Chavitin. Okay, so now, and this Mishnah describes what you do for the Korban Tamid, which is brought once in the morning and once in the afternoon. Okay, now it doesn't say, there's 6, it doesn't say there's, instead of 9 people, there's 18 people, and 9 do it in the morning and 9 do it in the evening. It's just, the point is, this is describing the process for every time the Korban Tamid is brought, meaning morning and afternoon. So, the 8th person brings the chavitin. V'im ita de betela ben ha'arbaim, hazimni de lo mishkach le'shmini b'chavitin. Now, if you're going to say that there are some cases after the Kohen Gadol dies and there's no one yet appointed in his place, where nobody brings the chavitin, because in the afternoon they don't bring it, then they should have specified that in the Mishnah. The 8th is for the chavitin in the case where they bring it, right? But sometimes it's not brought in the afternoon. Somehow it should have made reference to that, or it shouldn't have been listed here, right? So it seems weird that they list it as if it's always the case when it's not always the case. Okay, so now he says, right, so Hazin Delo Mishkach Leshmini B'Chavitin, they just explained, Hechidami, what would be that case? To make Kohen Gadol, V'lo Minu Acher Tachtav, right, exactly our case. That would be a case where if you say it was brought complete, but only once a day, meaning the replacements, basically, whether the communal money or the heirs would have to pay for it, would bring the same korban, but only once a day, the same amount, but wouldn't split it half, and do it in the morning, they would do it just in the morning. That doesn't fit with this Mishnah, because the Mishnah says the 8th is the chavitin, which sounds like always the 8th, right? There's always an 8th person, always does the chavitin, and right, wouldn't really fit with this theory that it wasn't brought sometimes in the afternoon. This is what Rava said. So pay attention, because now Amar Rabbanan Kamed to Rabbi Yirmia. Remember, Rabbi Yirmia was a Babylonian who moved to Israel, and somehow the Rava's students, I guess, went to Israel. They brought this in front of Rabbi Yirmia, and they told him Rava's proof. Amal, Rabbi Yirmia responds with the words, Bavlai tipshai, those stupid Babylonians. Okay, he's quoted as saying this in other places as well. Because you're sitting in a dark place, you say things that are dark, meaning unclear, right? You don't know what you're talking about. This is a ridiculous proof. Okay, and he really puts him down. Ella Dekatani says, I'm going to prove you're wrong, because it says in that Mishnah, okay, we're going to, basically your theory that just because sometimes it doesn't work and therefore the Mishnah shouldn't have mentioned it, is ridiculous, because look at 7 and 9 on the list. Shvi'i basolet, shi'i b'yayin. The 7th person brings the solet for what? For the minchat nisachim that was brought. Remember, the minchat, the korban tamid was brought. With it, there were libations. There was a minchat that went with it. There were wine libations. So the 9th one brings the oil. Hachinami de lo batzlei, what? Those have to happen every single day? They actually don't. How do you know they don't? Because it says minchatam v'niskehem, right? The minchas and the libations that go with it. The darshan balayla, uminchatam v'niskehem afilu lemachal. You could do them first of all at night. You could also do them the next day. Remember, we learned you even have up to 10 days, according to some people, to bring the libations. So you don't even have to bring them on that day. So it's not like every single day there was a 7th and a 9th person. So you could say, on every single day, there wasn't necessarily an 8th person. If the kohen gadol was dead, right? So, and what does Rabbi Yirmia say? I want you to remember Rabbi Yirmia. He's the one who asks all these what-if questions. So what does he say? It's very interesting to hear this in his mouth. Ela di'i lo katani. What does it mean, di'i lo katani? Di'i is if. He says the if cases, which are his favorites, right, aren't mentioned in the Mishnah. Okay? The Mishnah is talking about the usual cases, where you bring the minchas when you're supposed to, the nesachim on the, again, not when you're supposed to, but on that day with it. If everything goes the way it's supposed to, and you bring everything, okay, then they're going to have 9 people. But if the kohen gadol is dead, and they're going to bring the whole thing in the morning, and they don't bring in the afternoon, okay, the Mishnah is just not talking about that. Now, on the one hand, you think, well, Rabbi Yirmia, he loves the what-if questions. What, saying the Mishnah doesn't talk about what-if stuff? But I was thinking maybe it's specifically Rabbi Yirmia who is so sensitized to the what-if questions, and most people don't ask the what-if questions, and he's the one who's most aware that the Mishnah doesn't talk about what-if cases in general. He's the one who asks all the what-ifs, right? On the Mishnah, what if this, what if that? And maybe that's why Rabbi Yirmia was specifically noticing, and aware of, Mishnah don't generally speak in that language. Okay, I'm the one who likes to speak in that language, but not the Mishnah. So he says you can't prove that from the Mishnah, and he mocks Rava entirely and says, you stupid Babylonian. And so it was interesting because he himself was a Babylonian, but when he leaves and goes to Israel, he then kind of often attacks the Babylonians and doesn't like the way they learn things. So now word gets back to Rava. Hadrua kamei de Rava. So they bring back what Rabbi Yirmia said to Rava, and what is Rava's response? Amar, mibishitun amre kamayu, mitivutin lo amre kamayu. He starts blaming the rabbis. He says, why did you bring my bad proofs to bishutan, like bisha is like embarrassment? Why do you bring my bad comments to my bad proofs to Rabbi Yirmia, and you don't bring in mitivutam for my good ones? In other words, I have a lot of good things I said, right? We see Rava all over. Chaval, you didn't bring him the good ones, and then he calls me a Babylonian, stupid Babylonian. It's interesting, he doesn't get upset at Rabbi Yirmia. He gets upset at the rabbis for bringing this proof of his and not trying to back up Rava, support him by saying, but he says so many other great things. V'hadar amar Rava. But then Rava comes up with another answer. He says, I still believe I'm right, and I'm not going to prove it you're right. Maybe that wasn't a good proof, but I'll prove it from somewhere else. He says, Amar Rava, hani nami tivutin. This also is a good claim, meaning my answer is a good answer, and I'm going to prove it from somewhere else. Amar Kra, the pasuk says, solet mincha tamid. Okay, now, again, it calls this a tamid. What is a tamid? Well, it's like a korban tamid, right? So this minchat chavitin that the kohen gadol brings is called a tamid. Harehi lecha ki minchat tamidin. It's like a minchat tamidin that is always brought in the morning and the evening, no matter what. And therefore, he learns it's going to be anyway. So and then the Gemara is going to say again, my have'ala. This is time 2. We're going to see this word. We're going to see it more. Okay, what's the story? Because we have Rava, who has a good claim now. We have Rabbi Yirmia, who was completely against Rava. What's the story? Let's learn it from here. Explicit braita. So now we learn that it was brought. Basically, you had to bring double. Okay, so you could see maybe why the heirs were not so happy about this, according to Rabbi Shimon's theory, that they stopped doing it, right? Because they now not only had to pay the money for their father's korban, it wasn't even the kohen gadol anymore. Now they have to pay double because they have to bring an issaron in the morning, issaron in the afternoon. Okay, now that's going to lead us to our next sugya, which is going to start off, just to make it very clear, with a regular kohen gadol case, and then we're going to move into what if the kohen gadol dies. So right now we're back to the regular minchat chavitin of a kohen gadol. Now, with a minchat chavitin, it would be solet, right, the flour, with it they would also bring frankincense, like many of the Menachot had. So now there's a debate. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, pligi ba Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai veRabbanan. There's a machlok between Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai and the rabbis about how much lavona was brought. Okay, you're going to see now the machloket. Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai omeo mafrishla shnei kmatzim shel lavona. So you take your issaron in the morning. You're going to split it in half. Half an issaron in the morning, half an issaron in the afternoon. But each time you sacrifice that issaron, you're going to bring 2 handfuls of lavona in the morning, 1 for the morning, 1 for the evening. So that each half an issaron is going to, of solet, your mincha offering, is going to be brought with 1 whole handful of frankincense. But the rabbis say, Rabbanan Amre, mafrish la kometz echad, chatzi kometz shachari, chatzi kometz bein arbaim. Come the rabbis and they say, no, 1 handful of frankincense for the whole day. Half a kometz goes with the first one, half a kometz goes with the afternoon one. B'mai kamiflige, what's the root of their machloket? Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai savar lo eshkachan chatzi kometz tikarev. He says we have no precedent for seeing that you burn a half a kometz, a half a handful of frankincense at any time. The only way you have, right, frankincense is always a kometz, that's a shear. It doesn't make any sense to do half an amount. And Rabbanan savri lo eshkachan issaron debai shnei kmatzim. The rabbis say, what are you talking about precedent? I'll talk to you about precedent. There's no precedent of having an issaron with 2 handfuls of lavona. In other words, in the end, this is 1 amount. You take your issaron in the morning, you do half in the morning, half in the afternoon. Now, what generally goes with an issaron? A handful of lavona. So take in the morning your issaron with a handful, which is the usual ratio. And then split them both in half. Okay, that's the rabbis. So now comes our question. So we have a machlokah between the 2 of them. Is it 2 kmatzim of lavona for the day, or is it 1 kometz? So by Rabbi Yochanan, what happens in our case? Kohen gadol shenmeit v'lo minu acher tachtav. Where now you're going to double, because we learned just before, that you're going to double the amount of issaron that you bring. So l'Rabbanan, now, let's just go with Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai, you're going to see why he doesn't really ask here. If you're going to double and have an issaron in the morning, issaron in the afternoon. Now, what was Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai's problem with the kometz? There's never a chatzi kometz lavona. There's never a handful brought on the altar. So you bring 2 kmatzim in a regular case. Well, in this case, we're going to say he's also going to say bring 2 handfuls because you have an issaron in the morning with a kometz and an issaron in the afternoon with a kometz, and that's a perfect ratio. Like the rabbis were all worked up about the ratio. Well, that's the classic ratio, and right, there's no reason to think that he's going to double it. And it's not. Nobody thinks Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai thinks every issaron needs 2 kmatzim. It's just that here you have to bring 2 kmatzim for your issaron because you have no choice. Because if you're going to split it in half, you need a whole one each time. But when you're anyway bringing a whole issaron in the morning and a whole issaron in the afternoon, 1 handful is perfect. So according to Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai, there would be no change in the lavona, 2 kmatzim in case 1 and 2 kmatzim in case 2. Okay, that's right, one in the morning, 1 in the afternoon in both cases. But the Rabbanan, who basically say, well, it's a kometz for an issaron. So, and that's why you do half and half in a regular case. So would we say, huchpela lavonoto olo? So do you think according to Chachamim, in this case, you would bring double the lavona, meaning you would bring a whole lavona in the morning and a whole lavona in the afternoon? Now, here are the 2 options. Mi'amrina, do we say, mitoch shehuchpela soto, huchpela lavonoto? Since we doubled the solet, and since, remember, the rabbis talked about this ratio thing, it was a kometz to a lavona, then we double the lavona as well. O, dilma my de gale gale, my de lo gale lo gale. Or do we say that since they already explained, there was a special pasuk that says, specifically, you're supposed to bring a holy issaron in the morning and a holy issaron in the afternoon in this case. Remember, Rabbi Shimon darshaned it from Kliel Toktar. It's completely burned, meaning a whole issaron is burned in this rare case. And according to Rabbi Yehuda, it was ota. Ota meaning complete. Okay? So each one had it. There was a special pasuk that said the solet has to be doubled. But my de lo gali. But it never talked to the pasuk about the frankincense. So maybe you don't double the frankincense. Okay? So that's the question. According to the rabbis, since we double the amount of solet, do we double the amount and say kometz to issaron, handful to 1/10 of an ephah? Or do we say no? The solet, there's a special drasha that it's doubled. Just the solet, just the flour, not the amount of frankincense. So that's the question. And a follow-up question, Vishemen, what about the oil? Now, in the oil, there's no machloket between them in a regular case, okay? And there's no issue of half a handful in the whole. Can you do half a handful? Can't you do half a handful? So with the oil, this would be a question according to both of them, because there's no reason to think they would disagree about this. Bein la'Abi Yossi ben Dostai, or bein la'Rabbanan, mahu. Do you double the amount of oil? Remember, we learned 3 log of oil to 1 issaron. So again, do we say, well, we double the issaron, so we're going to double the oil, right? It's like a recipe. If you double your recipe, you double everything. Or do we say, no, it was a special pasuk that said you have to double the amount of flour. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to double the amount of oil. So that's a question according to both of them. Amar Rava, Tashma. So Rava wants to prove it from a Mishna later on in our chapter, which I recommend we open if you have access to open it. It's on Kuf Vav Amud Bet. And it's a Mishnah that says, okay, it starts with Harei Elai Etzim, how many, if you say I'm going to offer a voluntary offering of wood, how much do you need to bring? Okay, I'm skipping that, not relevant. Levona, if you say I'm offering levona in the temple, right, like you're going to offer frankincense, incense on the altar, lo yivchot mi kometz. You can't do less than a kometz of levona. And then it tells you, in other words, that's just telling you the shear for levona is, if I say I'm going to bring frankincense on the altar, the amount I'm supposed to bring is a handful. And then the Mishnah says, Chamisha kmatzim hem. There's 5 cases where this handful measurement is relevant. What are they? Number 1, Haomer Harei Elai Levona, the one we just said. I'm going to bring a levona to the temple. Number lo yivchot mi kometz. It has to be at least a kometz. Haminadev mincha. If you bring a regular mincha offering, I say I'm going to voluntarily bring a mincha offering. It goes with levona. How much levona? A kometz. Okay, yavi'ima kometz levona. Hama'ale et hakometz b'chutz chayav. What if I take the kometz and I burn it? I take the levona and I burn it outside. That's forbidden. I will be liable for doing that. Remember, hala'at chutz, burning something outside that you're not allowed to burn outside the asara. If I burn it outside, if I burn less than a kometz, I won't be obligated. When I get to a kometz, that's the measurement that's supposed to be done inside, so that's the measurement I'm going to be liable for outside. Number 4 and number 5 together. Shnei bezichin tu'unim shnei kmatzim. Okay, the 2 bowls of frankincense that go on the Shulchan, each one has a kometz. So there's a kometz for one and a kometz for the other. Those are the 5. So now, what is Rava going to do with this? Well, Tashma, Chamisha kmatzim hem v'im ita. Now, if in the case where the kohen gadol died, and other people have to bring in his place, right, the tzibur or the yorshim, the heirs, and we bring a full issaron with a kometz and a full issaron with a kometz, then it should have listed this in the Mishnah, right? This unique case should have been listed here. It's another case where kometz is relevant. So, right? There would be some cases where you'd actually have 7 because you'd have the mincha chavitin in the morning and the mincha chavitin in the afternoon. Right now, if you're the rabbi's position, why is the mincha chavitin not mentioned here? It also needs a handful. Well, because it needs a handful from when you bring it to the temple, but it gets split into half, right, on a normal day. So you would only burn half a handful, and that's why it's not in the Mishnah. But if this were the case, according to the rabbis, that you would double the levona in the case where the kohen gadol dies, then there would be 2 more cases. The mincha chavitin in the morning and the mincha chavitin in the afternoon in the event that the kohen gadol is dead. What does the Gemara say? Coming back to another thing we had earlier today. De'ilo katane. The Mishnah doesn't talk about rare cases. Okay, so the Mishnah is not going to talk about a rare case where the kohen gadol died and people were doing it, so that doesn't prove anything. So we didn't really get to a good answer from there. Now, Yativ Rav Papa v'Karmel lahashmata. Now, he said this whole discussion. He was sitting and he said this whole discussion that happened, that Rava brought this proof and then it was rejected. Amar le Rav Yosef bar Shmaya le Rav Papa. So Rav Yosef bar Shmaya says to Rav Papa, what do you mean? That's not a good rejection of his proof. Ha ma'aleh kometz b'chutz di'ihava v'katane. But the case of someone who offers the incense, the frankincense, outside the temple, who is obligated now, that's not a typical occurrence. That's an occurrence when somebody sins. How often does that happen, right? If this were to happen, then this would be on the list, which means if this were to happen, it should also be on the list. So That's actually, maybe it is a good proof. In the end, the Gemara asks, I think we're up to time number 3 today, my have Allah. Okay, so now you've confused us. You've suggested this is a proof. You've suggested it's not a proof. We don't know. Do you bring a whole kometz? Do you not? So Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Tashma. He's now going to prove from this braita, but it's going to take a few stages to get to the proof. Ditanya. Here's a braita that describes exactly our case, how much levona is going to be brought. Then we're going to prove that this must be Abba Yossi ben Dostai, and then from there we're going to learn to the rabbis. So it's a bunch of stages. Kohen gadol shemei v'lo minu acher tachtav. So the kohen gadol that dies, and they didn't appoint a new one in his place. Shlema shacharit ushlema ben arbaim. Okay, this, by the way, must have been the braita they brought before to prove that you have to bring a whole one in the morning, a whole one in the afternoon. Umafrish lashnei kamatzim. And now you take 2 kometzes of levona. Kometz shacharit, the kometz ben arbaim. You take a handful in the morning and a handful in the evening, or afternoon. Umafrish lashloshet lugin. And you take 3 log of oil, log b'mechza shacharit, log b'mechza ben arbaim, and you split it half in the morning and the afternoon. Now, mani, who does this go according to? Ilema Rabbanan. If this is the rabbis, what doesn't make sense? According to the rabbis, what would happen now? You're supposed to bring normally 1 issaron, 1 kometz, and 3 log shemen, right? And split it morning and night. Now, in this case, what did you do? You brought an issaron in the morning and an issaron in the afternoon. You brought 2 kometzim. So you basically doubled the kometz, which means that would be doubling the kometz. But the oil, you just bring 3 log altogether and split it 1.5. Now the assumption is, if you're the rabbis and you think that there's only 1 kometz normally, which gets split in half, and 3 log oil, which gets split in half, in our case, where we double the issaron, we either double the levona and the oil, or we don't double them, right? It's either all or nothing. Now this is a split, because according to the rabbis, this is a doubling of the levona, because it says 2 handfuls and not 1, but it's not doubling the oil, which is, right, it says 3 log instead of 6. So it would make no sense to say this braita is the rabbis, because it basically is doubling one and not doubling the other. Therefore, they say, right, so Mishna levona tadu uchpala, Mishna shamna de lo uchpal. It makes no sense to say the levona is doubled, but the oil isn't. There's no reason to distinguish. It's either the Torah, right, if you're going to double one, double everything, right, if you double the solet, then double everything else, or only where the pasuk told us, which is only by the solet and nothing else. Therefore, it must be Abba Yossi ben Dostai. Why? Because he thinks anyway you bring 2 kmatzim. Right? In the normal case, you bring 2 kmatzim. And then what do you see here? The regular kohen gadol chaviti needs 2 kmatzim. That's why you bring an issaron in the morning, issaron in the afternoon, but all together 2 kmatzim, 1 and 1, and all together 3 log, those are all the regular amounts. The 3 log, the 2 kmatzim, according to Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai, are the regular ones. So what do you see? Ulavona lo huchpela, v'shemen lo huchpal. Nothing was doubled here, other than the flour. Now, they say the following. Now, there's no reason to think, what we basically establish, and you have to just get this clear, is that according to, this braita is according to Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai, and nothing else is doubled other than the sola. Now, Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai and the rabbis disagreed about what? About how much levona is brought in a regular case. They didn't have an argument about, what if the kohen gadol is not doing it? So the assumption is that they both agree, either, yes, you double them, or no, you don't double them. So therefore, since Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai says, since he doesn't double the oil, the assumption is the rabbis wouldn't double the oil, they wouldn't double the levona. In other words, nothing is doubled according to the rabbis either. That's what they assume. They assume that this just means everyone agrees nothing's doubled. So from Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai's braita, you can learn about the rabbis as well. And therefore the answer is, only the solet is doubled. You bring the issaron of solet in the morning, issaron in the afternoon, but you bring 1 kometz and split it in half, 3 logs, split it in half. And that's the conclusion. Amar Rabbi Yochanan, halacha k'Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai. Rabbi Yochanan, though paskins, like Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai, that in a regular case, and in the case like we talked about, there's actually 2 handfuls of levona brought in, not just 1. Umi Amar Rabbi Yochanan hachi? Wait, did Rabbi Yochanan really say that? Because what's the problem? If so, then what does that mean? Every mincha chavitin needs a kometz of levona burnt with it, which means it should have been on the list in the Mishna in Kufav. And what's the problem? Ha Amar Rabbi Yochanan halacha kistam Mishnah. Rabbi Yochanan says we paskin like a stam Mishnah. Remember when there's no machloket in the Mishnah? Rabbi Yochanan always paskins that way, which means that it's not in that Mishnah. That Mishnah rules, no, you do half a kometz. That's why it didn't list our kometz in the Mishnah. And that's against Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai. So how could we say that Rabbi Yochanan holds halachas like Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai? Then in a regular case you bring a kometz in the morning, a kometz in the afternoon, but yet it's not in this Mishnah, which means you don't. So the answer, right, Utznan, chamisha chamatzim heim, right, that's the Mishnah. To which they answer, Marayinenu v'aliva de Rabbi Yochanan. There's a machloket about what Rabbi Yochanan says. One says he holds like every stam Mishnah, and the other one holds, no, not necessarily, and therefore he can say he holds like Rabbi Yossi ben Dostai, which doesn't match that stam Mishnah. So there's a machloket about what Rabbi Yehuda said, and with that, Hadran ala chatchelet, we finish the 4th chapter. Moving now to the 5th chapter. Kol ha-menachot ba'ot matzah, chutz mi-chametz shebetodah v'shtei alechem shehem ba'ot chametz. Okay, all menachot are matzahs, right, not leavened, other than the 2 unique exceptions that we've discussed, the shtei alechem on Shavuot, and the 10 loaves of the Todah, right? 10 out of the 40 loaves are bread, okay, are leavened. Now the problem becomes, how do you add, what is leavening? What do we do? We don't have yeast in the temple. What do we have? A sourdough, right? It's basically flour mixed with water. So, and it's made from the solet flour. So now the problem becomes, well, the minchas have specific measurements, like an issaron, right? So now you have to measure it exactly. What's the problem? When you add the sourdough has some solet in it, and how do you measure it? So this is going to be the problem. Rabbi Meir Omer hasuor bodelahem mitochanu machamtzan. Measure your issaron, then take out a little bit and make your sourdough with that. You know, anyone who's ever dealt with sourdough knows that it takes time for it to leaven, and that's why this doesn't make so much sense. So Rabbi Yehuda Omer af ye'enam muvchar. That's not going to come out so good. Ela mevi et haseor. You actually prepare one in advance that's already leavened. Notno letoch hamidah. Put it in the kli, the measuring utensil, and then add the rest of the solet, and that's counted as your issaron. Amrulo, the rabbi said to him, that's going to mess up your measurement, though, because the seor is already expanded, so it's got less, in the end, you're going to have less solet than you're supposed to, because you're going to measure an issaron, but you're adding something that has something else, it's already kind of expanded. So you're not going to have the right measurement. So we have this debate about how exactly you're supposed to measure this. Okay, last thing for today. Ba'amina Rabbi Preda, me Rabbi Ami. Minayin l'cholam menachot she'en ba'ot matzah. What's the source for all these menachot that they are matzot? To which the Gemara counter questions. It says, Minalim, what do you mean? Where is it from? Dichtiv b'ktiv ba, delo ktiv b'ktiv ba, zot Torah mincha, krevot abanei Aaron, l'fnei Hashem l'pnei hamizbeach, v'noter mimenu yochlu Aaron u'banav matzot te'achel. He says, okay, what are you talking about? How did you say, where does it say? Some of the minchas, it says it explicitly. It says it's matzah, okay, chalot, matzot, says it explicitly. When it doesn't say it explicitly, there's this general pasuk that says these are the rules for the mincha, and at the end of that pasuk it says, the next pasuk, whatever's left, Aaron and his sons eat matzot te'achel, they eat them while there's still matzah. So why are you asking this question? It's obvious where the source is. It says explicitly in the Torah. So the answer to this question, you'll have to wait till tomorrow. So what do we have? We started with this 4th takana of the Efer Parah Duman, how it doesn't have Me'ilah, and then they said, wasn't that Doraita? And then they explained the process that they went through. First they said it did have Me'ilah, then that created problems. Then we went to the Parah and Davar Shel Tzibur and Sirei Avodah Zarah, and who pays for them? Is it a new collection or is it from the money already collected? And then we had to figure out who said what. Then we got to it was completely, the whole issaron was brought in the morning in the case of the kohen gadol died, and then we had to prove that it was brought actually twice a day then as well, so a double amount was brought. Then we got to, double amount of the solet is brought. What about double amount of the frankincense? What about double amount of the oil? And that basically took us to the end there, and then, right, and that was based on this machloket of Yosef ben Tostai and the rabbis in general about Lavona. Is it 2 kmatzim or 1 kometz for the whole, right, for the regular one, and then therefore the question about the kometz was really only asked according to the one who said it was only 1. Would you bring 2? The one who said 2, obviously you would bring 2. You wouldn't even think about doubling it. And then we ended with this, the Menachot or all matzah, other than the 2, the shtei alechem and the korbanot todah, the breads that go with it, 10 of those breads that are chametz are the only unique exceptions that are chametz, and we're going to get more into this as we go on in the chapter. Wishing everyone a good day and a safe day, and again, Purim Sameach to those who are celebrating Purim today, Shushan Purim.